So I am not John Mallers. I'm Cynthia Longest, and I am what's called the 4D director for the state of Indiana. I'm a deputy director with the Department of Child Services Child Support Bureau. And we work closely with county officials on child support services. So John Mallers, who is one of my assistant deputy directors and is the head of what's called our Financial Quality Assurance Unit, is going to give the talk to you this morning, but I wanted to make sure to stop by to say hello because we really appreciate our partnership with you guys. We work most closely with the elected prosecutors and the elected clerks to deliver services, but as you all know, delivering services takes money, right? And so the federal funding stream that John's going to talk about more is pretty complicated when it comes to child support, and we need your assistance in making sure that those funds go to the clerks and the prosecutors and also some select courts within, it's not in every county, but some counties have cooperative agreements with the Child Support Bureau. So I just wanted to say hello. We look forward to working with you. Julie, we've worked with for a long time. Really appreciate our partnership with her. So thank you very much. And I hope you guys are almost done, I think, right? Yay. You've got the rest of the day. So I hope everybody has a great holiday, and I'm going to turn it over. John, I have to run because I've got another meeting, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia. And this isn't working. Let's do it manually. All right. I want to talk about some issues related to Title 4D that, like Cynthia mentioned, are going to affect you guys. Initially, I want to talk about Title 4D revenue streams. These are revenue, money coming into the county related to Title 4D child support enforcement that is going to be the responsibility of the auditor's office to deposit into the proper, or accounting for into the proper funds and proper accounts. The three streams are the monthly expenditure claims, which are monthly reimbursements that are claimed for by the 4D offices, clerk, prosecutor, and courts. There's an indirect cost allocation plan, which is also and these first two are what's called cost recovery grants. So the county incurs expenses and then they claim a reimbursement, and that's what the first two are. The third one are Title 4D incentive funds, and this is a separate federal appropriation that comes to the counties, and that's a little bit different. We'll get into those in more detail here in a minute. I'm also want to talk about the quarterly incentive balance form, which is a Title 4D form that the auditors do need to complete each quarter. It's pretty simple and self-explanatory, but we'll go through it. Just briefly discuss my group, the Financial Quality Assurance Department, and then I also want to talk about remittance notices. The state auditor's office electronically deposits all sorts of monies into the county. Some of that is related to child support, and the remittance notice you get from the state auditor has no detail on it. It just says Department of Child Services. So the day before that, we submit or email remittance notices to the offices, to the auditor's office, saying, hey, tomorrow you're going to get this amount of money. This is where it goes. And I want to go over those real quick, too, just so they're a little familiar to you when you get into office. Okay. The first revenue stream, monthly expenditure claims. Counties are entitled to a reimbursement for expenses that they incur enforcing child support orders at the county level. So that's through the clerk's office, through the prosecutor's office, which establishing paternity, the courts hearing the cases, the clerks working with ISETs, and they also potentially take some payments as well, child support payments at the counter and other 4D work that they do. And so that work that they do in their normal course of their business and the expenses that they incur out of their budgets, out of their general fund budget, be it wages, fringes, supplies, those type of expenses, 66% of the 4D eligible expenses are eligible for reimbursement back into the county. Again, these are direct expenses from the county budgets, and the reimbursement for these is claimed on what's called the MEC, or the Monthly Expense Claim Form. This form is prepared by a clerk, a prosecutor or a court or a vendor that they have. This is not the responsibility of the auditor's office to prepare, but I wanted to let you know that there is a revenue stream related to these, and it's a monthly reimbursement back into the county. Now, the reimbursement goes back into the county fund from which the expense incurred. So if they're paying wages or fringes to people that are working in Title 4D or child support, and they claim a reimbursement on those, and that's paid out of the general fund, that reimbursement goes back into the general fund. If they pay expenses out of clerk's perpetuation fund, and those are reimbursed, then that reimbursement goes back into clerk perpetuation. One thing to note is that whether it's a vendor or it's the office themselves preparing these claims, it takes information from the auditor's office. It takes monthly payroll reports, ledgers, the transaction history ledger, or combined ledger, whichever, depending on the software that you use. And that's information that they're going to need every month. And they're probably already receiving it. And when the change comes next year, that's information just so that you're not wondering, well, why are they asking for all these reports and stuff? This is information that they have to be able to complete these reports. And so I just wanted to let you know that that's information that those offices or a vendor will be requesting. All righty. That's the first revenue stream, the monthly expense reimbursements. Second revenue stream is more of an annual reimbursement, and it's based on indirect costs. So whereas, again, as the first example were expenses that they incurred out of their budget directly working on 4D, these are expenses from the county, from other departments that still benefit clerk or prosecutor or court, and those are eligible for reimbursement as well. They're kind of administrative or centralized expenses, and examples would be utilities. Let's say, for example, everybody's in the courthouse, and out of the courthouse budget, or maybe out of a commissioner's budget, utilities are paid for the courthouse or even an annex or wherever people are located. Well, those utilities clearly benefit the clerk and the prosecutor and the court, and so even though it's not paid by them out of their budget, a portion of that can be claimed as a 4D reimbursement under this federal grant. Security costs would be the same thing. If security's at the front door, they're benefiting everybody in the building. You can allocate that by square footage in the building, same as utilities. IT expenses, well, they service everybody in the county. HR expenses, liability insurance, the accounts payable, and the payroll function of the auditor's office. The auditor's office pays claims for the clerk, prosecutor, and court. They pay payroll for the clerk, prosecutor, and court. So some of those are eligible 4D expenses. And a vendor, every county has a vendor that prepares this indirect cost allocation plan. They have a expansive software that does all these calculations on all these allocations. But essentially what happens is it figures out the 4D portion of all these indirect expenses and how they relate to clerk, prosecutor, and court, allocated either by head count or transaction count or square footage, whatever the allocation is, and they come up with an amount that's eligible for reimbursement to the county for 4D. And then that's an annual reimbursement. Actually, it's paid in quarterly installments. That's a quarterly installment reimbursement into the general fund. Now, the indirect cost allocation plan all goes into the general fund regardless. Doesn't matter where it's come from or anything. The MEC depends on where it's paid from. The indirect cost allocation plan, the reimbursement all goes into the general fund. All right. Now the third revenue stream, again, not to reiterate, the first two are cost recovery. The county has incurred an expense out of their funds, out of levy money generally, and they claim a reimbursement after the expense is incurred. This third revenue stream are Title 4D incentive funds. And this is an appropriation by Congress. It's a line item appropriation by Congress, usually about $550, $600 million a year. And it's payable to the states for enhancing the child support program. Now, the states compete with each other to get their share of these funds. And there's 5 or 6 different performance metrics and how the states do relative to each other in these performance metrics determines how much they get. Now, case volume has a lot to do with it as well, but generally speaking, they still have to compete with each other. And just to give you a little frame of reference, about 10 or 12 years ago, we were ranked 35th in the country, I think, on these performance metrics, and we brought in about $5.5 million of incentive funds to the state. Just this last year, we were ranked 8th, and we brought in over $12 million. And so Indiana's been doing a lot better, in large part due to Cynthia, who's no longer here, but in large part due to Cynthia. So anyway, these incentive funds, they come into the state, and then the state, once we get that $12 million, we then have the counties compete in the same way that the states competed. And they compete based on those performance factors, and then the distributions go to the county. Now, once the county amount is figured out, it's broken down, as you see here at the bottom. 33.4% goes to the prosecuting attorney into their incentive fund, and that's Fund 8897. Those are Board of Accounts fund numbers. And so it's Fund 8897. And then 22.2% each goes into the clerk's incentive fund, 8899, the Title 4D incentive fund, and then the CSB, we keep 22.2% of that as well. Now, the 8895 incentive fund is kind of a catch-all incentive fund. Any 4D office in the county that has a cooperative agreement with us, and the cooperative agreement is simply a contract with us that enrolls them in the 4D program. So if they have a cooperative agreement with us, any of them can pay out of 80 or spend out of 8895. The prosecutor, pretty much 8897 is theirs. The clerk, 8899 is theirs. But 8895, prosecutor, clerk, or a 4D court, if you have one, can all spend out of that one. Okay. Now, what are incentive funds? Well, they, like I said, it's a direct allocation from the feds. They must be spent on 4D related expenses. Title 40 incentive funds cannot be spent to pave a parking lot. They can't be used by the health department. They have to be used by child support to enhance the program. They are not reimbursable, whereas the first two cost recovery grants, that's county money. It is reimbursable. These are not reimbursable. It's a direct money from the feds. They're allowing you to use it for this purpose. No reimbursement allowed. And they are meant to supplement or enhance the 4D program, not supplant county spending. So they're meant to be in addition to what the county is already doing for Title 4D and child support enforcement, not take away from that. So you're not supposed to replace county funds with these. Now, they generally do not require appropriation either, unless you're raising the wages of an elected official, a clerk or a prosecutor. If you're trying to increase their wages through incentive funds, that does require council approval. But if it's an eligible 4D expense, then they do not require appropriation. Now, that may or may not be a good idea, politically speaking, in a county. I mean, you guys know your councils better than I do, but that is technically the rule. These funds cannot go into the red. Now, incentive funds are distributed into the county quarterly. We don't always know when we start making the quarterly payments, we don't always know exactly what the amount the state's going to get from the feds. So we do a prospective quarterly payment, and it's based on 80% of the previous 3 years. So you'll get 4 installments, which are based on that 80% throughout the year. And then once we know what the federal amount is, then there's like a true-up final deposits. There's usually 5 deposits of these incentive funds a year. But they cannot go into the red. So if a prosecutor's office, for example, is wanting to spend something out of their incentive fund for a project or a piece of equipment, and it's going to put the fund into the red, even if you know a distribution or a deposit is coming in the next few days, that's not allowed. It's not allowed under SBOA rules, and certainly not allowed for incentive funds. Incentive fund expenditures are reported by the 4D offices, again, on the Quarterly Incentive Expenditure Report, or the QIE. We have a lot of acronyms in CSB, which in itself is an acronym. So, but the QIE, Quarterly Incentive Expenditure Report, is completed quarterly by the 4D offices. And it is a report where they put down each month how much they've spent out of incentive funds. And that is information that we need to maintain or to monitor what their expenses are. So again, that's a report that's prepared by the 4D offices, not the county auditor. However, there's also a report called the QIB, or the Quarterly Incentive Balance Report, and this report is required or does need to be completed by the county auditor's office. And all it is, it's fairly simple. All it is reporting the balances of all of the 3 incentive funds each quarter. So at the end of each quarter, let's say at the end of December, or December 31, the next QIB is due on January 15th. So between January 1st and the 15th, You just look up online or onto your software and pull out the balances of each of those 3 funds, put it into our 4D expenditure portal, electronically submit it to us, and that's really pretty much all there is to it. In addition to that, we also request that you submit copies of the ledgers or the fund balance reports that show those fund balances, and ideally the ledgers too that show the transactions. And the reason for that is one of the duties that we have is monitoring incentive fund expenditure, and we have to reconcile these things every quarter. And so we'll look at a QIB from the end of a quarter, then we'll look at the QIE that say the prosecutor or the clerk submitted, and we know what the deposits are coming in because we're sending those out, and then we look at the QIB at the end of the next quarter, and it needs to reconcile. So this minus the expenses plus the deposits should equal this. And if we don't, if there's a variance, which there occasionally are, then we have to investigate. And so if we have those ledgers already, that avoids us having to contact you guys again later for the ledgers. So when you input the information into the 4D expenditure portal, there's a place in there to download the ledgers, and that's been, you guys have been great doing that in the past, and we just respectfully request you continue doing that information, or sending that information. All right, here is a picture or a snapshot of our, a screenshot of our 4D expenditure portal for the CIB. And if you look, the first row or the first line says for the regular incentive fund balances as of the end of the quarter. That's the top row there in the middle with the boxes. That is where you would input when you look on in your software, that's where you input the balances for the prosecutor fund, for the clerk fund, and for the Title 4D incentive fund. And you do that at the end of each quarter. Now the second row is something I need to talk about a little bit. When I mentioned we do that incentive fund reconciliation, there are some transactions related to incentive funds that aren't going to show up on the QIE that the prosecutor or the clerk or the courts do. These are not expenditures that they would do for equipment or supplies or wages or anything like that. These are more auditor-initiated transactions. We call them balance adjustments. And so if any of these occur, it has to be reported by the auditor's office, or we're going to have a variance and there's going to be an issue. And so let me show you what some of these are. The first balance adjustment would be a correction of an error. In the course of our monitoring, there are occasions where we find out that incentive funds were spent on something that wasn't 4D related. For example, something is maybe in a prosecutor's office, it's used 50-50 between criminal and the 4D side, but they paid all of the cost out of incentive funds. That happens on occasion. So they have overspent from the incentive fund. The incentive fund is going to need to be restored. And so that's considered a correction of an error. So in that instance, that would be a positive balance adjustment on the QIB. So if I go back here, and you see under the left one, the prosecutor's office, it says balance adjustments. Let's say they paid $5,000 too much for incentive funds. Well, the auditor is going to have to take $5,000 from the county general and actually put it back into that incentive fund. And so you would report that there as a $5,000 positive balance adjustment. And then in the box, the big box below, just a quick explanation of what happened. Another example are balance transfers. Again, there are a lot of occasions where, let's say a prosecutor has a project, whether it's going paperless or something for non-custodial parents or something, a big project that's going to help the 4D program and enhance the program and help get money to kids faster. But they don't have enough incentive fund money to pay for this. So, but the clerk does. The clerk's sitting there on a pile of money, and they haven't been using it, and they could transfer that over. So we have a form on our page. We have it's called the Child Support Resource. We have a website that Child Support Bureau has, and we've got a page on there that has a lot of our forms that I talk about, and there's a balance transfer form on there. But you can transfer from one incentive fund to the other. So the clerk could transfer from their incentive fund to the prosecutors, and then they could subsequently pay it for whatever their project is. So if you had a transfer like that, we can go back to this form. Let's say they transferred $10,000 from the clerks to the prosecutors. Well, there'd be a negative $10,000 under the clerk's balance transfer line or balance adjustment line, and then you'd have a positive $10,000 under the prosecutors. And again, there'd be a little explanation. And so balance adjustments corrections of an errors and balance transfers are two of the balance adjustments that need to be reported if they occur, need to be reported on the QIB. Third example is the cost allocation plan, that indirect cost allocation plan that I talked about with all the utilities and those type of expenses. Most counties pay for that. They'll pay the vendor for preparing it out of the general fund, and you actually get 66% of that cost back to the county. It's 2/3 reimbursable. But some counties use these Title 4D incentive funds, and that's acceptable. That's an allowable expenditure. And this is really the only instance where a non-4D office can spend incentive funds. Every other instance, the incentive funds can only be spent by a clerk, prosecutor, or a 4D court. This is one where the auditor can initiate the expenditure, or if it's out of commissioners, sometimes we see that as well. So if you're going to pay that fee out of the incentive fund, then if we went back to the previous page, it would be a negative adjustment under whichever fund you spent the money from. And lastly, interest income. There are some counties that have these incentive funds in a separate interest-bearing account, and then the interest is actually deposited back into the fund, which increases the balance. Well, if you do that, again, that's fine, but it needs to show up as a balance adjustment for the interest each month, or how often the interest is there. Is that all pretty clear and make sense? How are we doing on time? All right. One thing I wanted to note was that a lot of you are new going into the office, I'm assuming. If you don't have access to the 4D expenditure portal, then you need to get access as quickly as possible. The first, like I said, once you get in, the first report is actually due January 15th. That would be the fourth quarter QIB. And so if you don't have access to the 4D expenditure portal, email us at this email address, csbacrequest, and David Buckley is our 4D portal administrator. He will start the process of getting you guys access to this. Now, the MEC, the monthly expense claim, and the QIE that I talked about that are prepared by the 4D offices, they are required to have a separate preparer and a separate certifier. They have to have that segregation of duties. The QIB only has one. It's only one person. And so there's this preparer and certifier are the same. And we strongly recommend that the elected official is at least one of those, is at least one person that has those rights. Now, you can have a designee or designees if you want that can do this form if you're out or you just want somebody else to do it. But we strongly recommend and request that the elected official actually have access as well. So if you don't, or this in your office, maybe there's been turnover and nobody does, that sort of thing, you might want to certainly get yourself in, access as quickly as possible, and any other people that you might think in your office want to get access as well. All right. A little bit about my department. My department was created as a result of a Board of Accounts audit finding that CSB received several years ago, stating that we weren't monitoring these expenses properly. We weren't monitoring the spending of incentive funds. We weren't monitoring checking the accuracy of the MECs or the monthly reimbursements. And so our corrective action plan was to create my group, which started doing this, and it's evolved over the last several years. Now, one of the main duties that we do are what we call the financial quality assurance reviews. And this is where we look at 1/3 of the counties every year, and we go through and we actually have a visit to the county. We visit with the clerk, the prosecutor, if there's a 4D court, and we visit with the auditor's office. We gather all the information we need, and we recalculate those monthly expense reimbursements. And we compare to what the county actually claimed. And if there's, we see if there's a difference, if they claim too much or they claim too little. In addition to that, we look at their documentation, because one of the main things we talk about when we talk to clerks and prosecutors is you have to have documentation to justify what you're claiming. It's a federal grant, highly regulated. You have to have documentation to justify what you're claiming. So we look at how are they calculating the expenses. We look at, do you have proper documentation to justify these expenses? We look at, do you have segregation of duties. And the purpose of this is not only for us to satisfy our audit requirement, but it's to help the counties avoid child support audit requirements from Board of Accounts. I look at a large part of my job is keeping counties from having to worry about a Board of Accounts audit finding. We also do a lot of county office visits, whether they have questions on how the portal works, or they have questions about claiming or documentation. We've even helped, last year we helped set up 4 new 4D courts around the state, get them started and all that they need to do to get started to claim reimbursements. We sent out guidances for how to treat certain types of expenses that we run across more and more throughout the year. We do claims trainings, which are a day-long training, which is real deep and in-depth on how this whole process works. A lot of counties and offices that do the reimbursements themselves, they don't use a vendor. A lot of those people attend, and even people with a vendor, because quite frankly, it's your grant. Even though you have somebody else working for it, it's your grant and you're the one responsible, or the 4D offices are the ones responsible for these numbers being right. The SBO audit findings, part of our audit finding is when they do have an audit finding, we have to follow up on it. So Board of Accounts will have an audit finding in a county related to child support, and we are the ones that actually have to follow up and make sure the corrective action plan has been implemented. And lastly are the incentive fund reviews, like I talked about a little bit earlier. All right, a little bit about remittance notices. I talked about these earlier. Again, there's a myriad of funds coming into the county from all different areas. The state auditor, the remittance notice from the state auditor for some of these things just says Department of Child Services, and it says $9,800 or whatever, 9808. And you won't know, well, what does that mean? That's Department of Child Services 9808. Well, the day before the EFT comes into the county, we will email out one of these remittance notices, one of these remittance notices, and I wanted to kind of go over it with you so that you were a little more familiar with them, and it would help you, be comfortable and know where these funds go. So if you look at the arrow at the top, it says regular FFP reimbursement. And so what that means is FFP stands for Federal Financial Participation. That's the regular direct reimbursement that they do monthly on the MEC. So this is just regular monthly reimbursement under Title 4D. The second arrow there pointing to the yellow says Fund 1000. So that means that goes into the general fund. And it tells you there, it kind of breaks down what it's from. It's got the, the clerk at the top and then the prosecutor at the bottom. So that's the monthly reimbursement for the clerk for that month, and that's the monthly reimbursement for the prosecutor for that month, and those are the dollar amounts. Now, the only other thing that might change from this is there might be a star or an asterisk to the right of those dollar amounts, and it would show up down at the bottom. It would say, of this amount, say $3,000 came from another fund, clerk perpetuation or something like that. In that case, then you would know that that amount goes back into that fund, and then the rest of it goes back into the general fund. So just assume it all goes in the general fund unless there's a star or something that tells you a portion of it goes somewhere else. Remember I said the monthly reimbursements, the reimbursement goes back into the fund from which the expense incurred. And so that's what this shows here. Uh-huh. Well, generally what that means is at the beginning of the year, the prosecutors, there's a certain dollar amount that's set out by CSB and IPAC that the prosecutors get a certain portion of their reimbursement at 100% at the beginning of the year. And so generally that's what that means is that's part of the 100% reimbursement. Rob Conrad knows those a little bit more than I do, but more often than not, if there's a comment there, it's at the beginning of the year, they'll get reimbursed, not 66%, but they'll actually get 100% until they've met that dollar amount, and then it gets 66% the rest of the year. And so that's generally what those type of things mean. But does that seem pretty clear, make sense to everybody? I want to give you an example of a couple more here real quick. Now that was one for the MEC. This is one for the cost allocation plan, that indirect cost allocation plan. If you see the top arrow, now it says 2018 indirect cost reimbursement. The first one said regular FFP reimbursement. Now this one says 28 indirect costs. So you know it's indirect cost. The second arrow points Fund 1000. As I said earlier, indirect costs always go into the general fund, no matter what. So, and then these are quarterly distributions. It says, what county is it? Decatur County? No, I can't even read anymore. Yeah, Adams County, and second quarter. And then the dollar amount. So you would just put that as miscellaneous revenue right into the general fund.
Just as a comment too, the CFDA numbers on that report too, that's a good thing to see on there as well.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, and that would probably correspond to the state of auditors report as well. And hopefully the dollar amount would too. Okay, and then the last remittance notice is for the incentive funds. Again, the top arrow says FFY, or Federal Fiscal Year 2017 Prospective Incentive. So this is one of those incentive fund, quarterly incentive fund distributions, which is based on 80% of the prior year, so we call it a prospective incentive payment. The middle arrow pointing to the yellow incentive there, so it tells you this is incentive funds, not general funds. And then the arrow pointing down tells you which funds the amounts go into. So you've got prosecutor, Fund 8897, clerk, Fund 8899, and then Title 4D, Fund 8895. You can see that, and then just scroll over or look over, and you can see what dollar amount. And so when this comes in, and you get this dollar amount, $10,000, you know the $44,000 goes into the 8897, and the rest go into those other funds.
And you brought up a good point. Can you explain a little bit what the CFDA number actually represents in an auditor's room?
Actually, I can't.
Well,
That-
you'll need that number to know that number when you're reporting your grants, for your annual report. So, that's something to be aware of as far as where to find it. And each federal agency has their own number, so they're similar, you're gonna have the same CFDA number. That's really important when you're doing your grant information gateway. You gotta have CFDA number if you're gonna say federal.
Thank you. Yes?
I will add one thing, for the benefit of other, new auditors is, when you go through your first audit, for your Title 40, sit with your auditors and have them show you how they audit the Title 40. It's really helpful. And, you know, they're there to help you learn as well, and they may be able to, provide you with ways to report accurately your Title 40. That was a huge help to me, was to sit down with a state board of accounts auditor who was auditing that while they were doing it. Then I knew exactly what I needed to do the next year for my
Right.
reporting, and how they were going to go back and look at all of those, various reimbursements and payments.
Right. And like I mentioned, we review 1/3 of the counties every year, so we do visit the clerk, prosecutor court, and the auditor's office. Our review with the auditor's office related to Title 4D is more about understanding how the fringe benefits are paid, understanding how health insurance is, because health insurance has been a sticky issue, especially self-insured health insurance, figuring out what the actual expense is under Title 4D. And so we do meet with the auditors to go through various information like that, just to make sure we understand exactly how the county is accounting for their fringe benefits. And if you have any questions with us, obviously you can contact us anytime, and certainly we'll discuss anything when we're there as well. And that is the end of my presentation. If there's any other questions, I'll certainly be glad.